So we are probably looking at the next 10 to 20 to 30 years of Cold War between US and China. And that's very, very dangerous news because this Cold War, last Cold War, the world escaped nuclear Armageddon. That doesn't give us a guarantee that in this Cold War we will escape that. And so this last quarter laid the foundation for a new hostility in the world, which could potentially risk the survival of humankind in the next decade or two. In the next 2 or 3 years, Chinese will be the only ones with a permanent presence in the space. And what is happening now is that the Russians have told the Chinese that they would like to be part of the Chinese space station. So unlike the earlier space station where the Russians were equal partners with the Americans, and the Japanese and the Europeans also had a very respected role there, here it will be a Chinese space station, and you can all, even India, they are also happy to have India to join them, or whoever else wants, they can join them there. But it will be under the Chinese suzerainty, this space station. And what the Chinese are probably signaling is that and they did it exactly on the day these G7 and NATO summits were, and the week that G7 and NATO summits were taking place. And they are saying, you be busy in organizing on yourself on the earth, but we will control the space. And from there, we can control the telecommunication infrastructure of the world. The people who have a real leverage over Taliban is the Pakistani ISI. Right. Taliban can't survive without support from the ISI. And I have no idea what deal the Americans have made with the ISI. It looks like they probably have reconciled to the fact that Taliban will have a significant control on Afghanistan, if not total control. And Pakistan will be very happy with that kind of an outcome. But for India, it's important since Pakistan will acquire what is called the strategic depth if they have a control on some Afghan territory through Taliban.
You were listening to Sundeep Waslekar. This is Indrajit Gupta, and I caught up with Sundeep in early July of this year to take stock of the world in 2021. Sundeep and I spoke about all the major happenings from the second quarter, from April to June this year, and there was plenty to talk about. From the major summits that were planned across Europe with Russia and the US, President Putin and President Biden, the NATO summit, as well as the G7, and the implications are pretty significant, as you'll hear. Then there were elections in Iran and Israel that had fairly profound implications on the politics in the Middle East, as well as the US pullout of Afghanistan. And that has bearings on the geopolitics in our own region between India and Pakistan and China. So without much ado, let's dive into that conversation.
So hello, Sundeep, great to catch up again for the second edition of the World in 2021 podcast. This is where we kind of take stock of some of the most important global events that would shape our world this year and beyond. And like what we had done in April, when we had taken stock of the Jan to March cycle, here we're going to take stock of April to June. And we'll hear from you what you see as some of the most critical developments in the last 3 months, last quarter. So over to you, Sundeep. What's kind of caught your attention? What would you like to start with?
Well, good to join you again, Indrajit. I'm enjoying this quarterly podcast. In the last quarter, the one thing that came to everybody's attention, not only mine, was the summitry conducted by President Biden. He wanted to announce that America is back in the world, and he went on a tour of Europe. There was a G7 summit, there was a NATO summit, there was a bilateral summit between President Biden and President Putin. I think this was most remarkable because it did have a lot of impact on the relationship between superpowers, between US, Russia, and China. So that was most striking. I think also in the last quarter, we had some important developments in the Middle East. There was a war between the Hamas in Gaza and Israel. And there was very important election in Israel and also in Iran. And there was a small interesting development in the UAE. So Middle East was very much in the limelight. We also had some other developments. We had more evidence of global warming in the last quarter, raging fires in North America, cyclone in India. We had some developments with regards to the regulation of the artificial intelligence in the EU. So it was quite an active quarter.
Yes, Sandeep, clearly, I mean, there's a lot that's happened. It was quite the same in the first quarter as well. There's been no let up, clearly. I wanted to kind of start with the first point on the summitry. In the last conversation that we had, you had spoken about America's and President Biden's challenge of bringing the EU around to supporting him on China, and try and kind of building some kind of a loose coalition. How did that go, and what do you see as the significance of the three big summits that you spoke about: G7, NATO, and the presidential summit with Putin?
Well, with G7 and NATO, definitely the effort of the United States was to mobilize the Western democracies against China. They are also concerned about Russia, but the focus was very much on China. The Europeans were quite realistic about the threat coming from Russia, and they agreed in the NATO summit to describe Russia as a threat. But there were differences of opinion over China. And finally, they agreed to describe China as a systemic challenge, not exactly as a threat. The Americans would have liked to project China as a threat. But where Biden did succeed in this summit was that he did manage to swing the Europeans a little bit. Earlier, during the Trump presidency, the Europeans were almost becoming non-aligned in the conflict between US and China. And President Biden did succeed in shifting the European leaders towards the American point of view. And he did succeed in forming some kind of a loose alliance both against Russia and China. And even though it was tempered, even though it was not as sharp as he would have liked, he did succeed in turning them around. And I think this is a big change as compared to the end of last quarter, when definitely until then the Europeans were a lot more neutral. And now they are very much buying the Biden line of the need for Western democracies to come together against what Biden described as the autocracies in Moscow and Beijing. And that is the other thing that Biden did, that he kind of presented his doctrine during these summits. And his doctrine, which will shape the next 4 years of his presidency, is to look at the world as a conflict between democracies and autocracies. And that is very clear. Also, there are indications that depending on COVID, he will try to convene a summit of democracies, not only Western democracies, but he will include India and some of the African and Latin American countries also in this summit of democracies. He will probably try to do it towards the end of the year. So Biden is definitely redefining the word in the Cold War language, when there was a competition between democracy and autocracy, or between capitalism and communism. And so now he's again redefining the word as a contest between democracies and autocracies. But for him, the autocracy in Beijing is a lot more significant than autocracy in Moscow. He did have some significant achievements in his meetings with President Putin. First of all, they issued a joint statement on nuclear arms race. In this statement, they reiterated what was said many years ago by Reagan and Gorbachev, that nuclear wars cannot be won and therefore they should not be fought. So they made a commitment to this belief or philosophical framework for conducting their strategic relationship. Also, they instituted a strategic stability process or a dialogue, and they decided to review the progress in 6 months' time. See, one of the first things that Biden had done when he was elected as the or installed as the president at the end of January was to renew the New START treaty by 5 years. It is a treaty that imposes limits that are actually put in a hair trigger alert. And now, by what Biden did, he took the next step to start negotiating process with the Russians as to how to advance the arms control regime. And after the summit with Putin, both Biden and Putin spoke separately about the horrors and dangers of these modern weapons. So it was quite a remarkable achievement that, at least in principle, they agreed to take ahead the arms control dialogue. They also agreed to cooperate on cyber security and to not to interfere in each other's affairs by using cyber weapons. So that was also quite remarkable. Well, they disagreed on the Russian opposition and human rights and the Russian gas pipeline to Germany and all that. But that was expected. But the understanding to take ahead the strategic dialogue was something significant. So, which leaves out China. And so the end result of this symmetry is that the Cold War between United States and China is now firmly on the rise. And it will characterize the next 4 years of Biden presidency. Absolutely no doubt about that. And probably the period beyond, irrespective of who gets elected as the president of the United States after Biden. If it is Democrats, they will continue. If it is Republicans, they will continue even more vigorously. So we are probably looking at the next 10 to 20 to 30 years of Cold War between US and China. And that's very, very dangerous news because this Cold War, I mean, last Cold War, the world escaped nuclear Armageddon. That doesn't give us a guarantee that in this Cold War we will escape that. And so this last quarter laid the foundation for a new hostility in the world, which could potentially risk the survival of humankind in the next decade or two.
Why do you kind of sound so, dire, Sandeep, about the prospects of this Cold War? What makes you a little more anxious than the Cold Wars of the past?
No. I am the Cold War of the past was also quite worrying, and we as humanity were just lucky that we escaped any kind of universal death during the last Cold War. And this Cold War is proving to be no exception. You have a raging arms race taking place between the United States and China. You have new kinds of weapons that have arrived, which didn't exist earlier, like hypersonic missiles. I mean, the year 2020 was marked for COVID, the 12 months of 2020. But the 12 months of 2020 also gave rise to the hypersonic missile race. So while the world was fighting COVID on one side, on the other hand, US, Russia, and China were developing these new missiles, which go at an extremely fast pace, which are invisible, which determine their own trajectory, and basically they take the control of many decisions away from the human hands. So these are the kinds of weapons. Then there are lethal autonomous weapons, there are killer robots, there may be killer pathogens in some laboratories. So these are the kinds of weapons which will characterize the next Cold War, which has now started and formally affirmed in the last quarter of 2021. And these are a lot more dangerous than the nuclear weapons that existed in the last century. And plus, the nuclear weapons anyway continue to exist. It's a deadly combination.
Fair enough. Last quarter, Sandeep, you had spoken about Biden's entry in some ways. So, at the end of these three summits, do you believe that Biden has been able to undo some of the damage that Trump had done to America's place in the world? Would that be fair to assume that he's kind of recovered a lot of the lost ground?
Definitely. See, he has restored the multilateral order to a large extent. The WHO is back in business. America is back in the Paris Accord on climate change. And most important, he has saved the transatlantic alliance. And the Europeans who were veering towards some kind of a distance, and they were even thinking of an independent defense policy. And Biden has really managed to build up confidence, revive NATO, and prove to the Europeans particularly and to the Western democracies that America is back, as he very fondly called.
Right. But having said that, you had also spoken about the whole economic interests at play, because Europe and especially Germany was moving into the vacuum that the Chinese had, the Americans had created in China, and doubling down on investments there. Now, how did Biden in some ways, or how is Biden planning to kind of ensure that there is no tilt towards China because of the Europe's economic interests in some ways? Do you think that's
Well, Yeah, EU negotiated a major investment accord with Chinese.
Yes,
And one of the new developments that took place in the last quarter was that accord has run into difficulties in the European Parliament.
I see.
So the European Commission wants to go ahead with it, and some of the big states like France and Germany want to go ahead with it. But the European Parliament, which needs to endorse the accord, it has put in a lot of obstacles, and so currently it is not been endorsed by the Parliament. And this is again the result of the Biden presidency, because a lot of Europeans now may be seeing that there is no advantage in being independent and rebuilding and building relationship with China. Maybe they have to be a lot more sensitive to the American concerns. But this is an open game right now. We can't really say where it will lead. But there is definitely a big difference as compared to the beginning of the year, when this accord was all set to be adopted, and now it has run into difficulties.
Interesting. Interesting. So we just kind of also touch upon the point you made about cyber weapons, because in that summit with Putin, that was kind of remarkable in the sense that more than nuclear weapons, there was a lot of conversation around controlling cyber weaponry, and that's emerging as a new systemic kind of risk. How should one best understand that piece? Because I don't think there was full clear consensus on that issue.
Well, Indrajit, the summit between President Biden and President Putin, when they decided to cooperate on cybersecurity, it was more in terms of using or not using cyber technology to interfere in each other's affairs.
Right.
And that has been described by some sections of the media as a constraint on cyber weapons, but that's not exactly cyber weapon. Cyber weapons, to me, it's really interfering in the command and control systems of conventional or nuclear weaponry. I don't think that was under discussion. I think what was under discussion was not to have the cyber technology being misused to interfere in each other's political systems, and I would say that would also include critical infrastructure.
Right. Fair enough. So just moving on, you spoke about the action in the Middle East, particularly in Israel and Iran and UAE. You want to kind of walk us through what really were the highlights?
One of the interesting developments that took place in the last quarter was the election in Israel. But before that, you had a war between Hamas in Gaza and Israel, and this war started over something that happened in Jerusalem. That Israelis tried to evacuate the Palestinians from their houses in Sheikh Jarrah locality, and then they also sent their forces to the Al-Aqsa mosque, which is a very holy site for the Palestinians. So Hamas reacted by sending rockets to Tel Aviv, and the Israelis in retaliation attacked Gaza, and the war went on. But part of the story as to why Israelis did that, why did they evacuate or forced to evacuate the Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah at that time, because Netanyahu was facing a very difficult time in the election results, and he didn't get a clear majority. There were efforts being made to form an alternative government, and Netanyahu probably thought that a war with the Hamas will unify the country behind him and not give an opportunity or not make it possible for the opposition to come to power. So it was on the surface an Israel-Palestine conflict, but actually it was an internal Israeli conflict where Netanyahu was trying to take advantage of the situation to perpetuate his own power when he had lost a majority, very narrowly. So that is what happened. Now, Biden being in White House made a tremendous difference, because basically Biden called up Netanyahu and he asked him to enter into a ceasefire as soon as possible. If Trump had been there, he would have given Netanyahu a long rope. Biden really forced Netanyahu to announce a ceasefire, and the ceasefire was negotiated by the Egyptian intelligence agency between Hamas and Israel. And the Egyptians always they negotiate between Hamas Israel. So they negotiated this ceasefire. And since Netanyahu had to announce the ceasefire under American pressure with some help from the Egyptian intelligence, he had no alternative. And Israel went back to the formation of the government. And all the parties came together to keep Netanyahu away from power. And so they have formed an interesting government where the Prime Minister, Natali Bennett, is what you might call an ultra right wing pro settler politician who doesn't recognize Palestinian rights. But in his own office, in the Prime Minister's office, there is a deputy minister, and his name is Mansour Abbas. And so you have an Arab Israeli as a deputy minister to serve in the office of the Prime Minister with a mandate to protect the interest of the Arab Israelis. And this government is to a large extent controlled by Yair Lapid, the foreign minister. And they have really brought together all the parties, and they have worked out a beautiful power sharing scheme whereby there is a prime minister, an alternate prime minister, two deputy prime ministers, and this Arab Israeli as a deputy minister in the prime minister's office. So they have worked out a very interesting power sharing scheme, and they have managed to keep Netanyahu away. Also, what they have agreed is that the focus of the government will be on economic development and infrastructure development, and they will not get into identity politics. What the Israelis have proved is that for 15 years, Netanyahu was trying to project that there was no alternative to him. And the Israelis have proved that you don't need to have an alternative ready. That if you want to get rid of a politician like Netanyahu, who was organizing a war just to keep himself in power to perpetuate his own position, you can come together and form some kind of a coalition and work out some kind of a pragmatic power sharing arrangement, because nobody would have ever expected this Netanyahu Bennett to be the prime minister, but they have worked it out. So this is a very interesting development, that just the creation of the new Israeli cabinet and their focus on development and infrastructure for governance, rather than indulging, and very clear decision not to indulge in identity politics. And Netanyahu, of course, knows that. So Netanyahu will try to do everything possible from the opposition benches to raise the Palestinian issue and to raise the profile of the identity politics in order to force the schisms between the government. So we have to see what happens. This government is also with a thin majority. We cannot say it will last forever. Currently, there is a lot of enthusiasm in Israel and a lot of feeling of hope that they may last for a long time. But realistically speaking, we don't know what is going to happen.
The end of the Netanyahu era, Sundeep, I mean, at least for the moment, at least,
Yes.
is interesting, because a lot of people, I'm sure, would have focused on the Tina factor as well, saying that
Yes.
there is no alternative, and he's been one of the longest serving prime ministers
Right.
in the country. So,
Right.
to your mind, I mean, was there a kind of public kind of pressure building up on him, or that the opposition could capitalize on? I mean, his rivals at least.
No, I think first of all, the Israeli politicians proved a premise or a theory that there need not be an alternative.
Okay.
You know, Netanyahu's argument was there is no alternative, and these people said there need not be an alternative.
Right.
Why should you think in terms of a singular alternative? That
Right.
you can come together and form almost a national government, which is what they have found. I won't say that the public pressure was solely against Netanyahu. I think Israel was divided in two camps. There were some people who were very much in favor of Netanyahu as a person, and also his political priorities and his ideology. And there were a lot of other people who believed that Netanyahu had done enough of manipulation, and it was now time to have a new set of leaders to take his place. And these two camps were more or less evenly divided, as was the result of the parliamentary election.
Right.
So we can't really say that the pressure was only from one side. In fact, there was a lot of pressure on the present government before it became the government to prohibit or to prevent the formation of this government. And there were people who were going outside the houses of the members of parliament before the government was formed. There was a period of 1 week for the formation. So they were going outside the house, threatening them and not to support this government and to change their position and support Netanyahu. So all this was happening. But in the end, these people have prevailed, and you now have an interesting coalition in Israel.
Sure. Sundeep, what would this mean for the conflict in the region, especially with Hamas and Gaza? Are there any major implications, or one can't expect too much change?
No. I think there will be a lot of changes. I think, first of all, this government has decided that if there is any offensive action from Hamas, they will react. This they have already decided. Okay. So there is no disunity of opinion in the government between the left and the right and the ultra-nationalists and the liberals and whatever. But beyond that, they will not do anything to deepen the conflict with the Palestinians. Right. So that is a very significant development. So by and large, we can expect that the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians will be on a back burner. If Hamas also behaves smartly, if Hamas provokes some kind of a conflict, then of course you will have a different kind of a outcome. But if Hamas also kind of reins its own horses, I think this government is not looking for a conflict. Okay. And they definitely don't want a conflict in the West Bank. And they will try to avoid it as much as possible. Though Netanyahu will try his best to try to find some way to try to create the conflict.
Got it. Sundeep, I wanted to focus our conversation on Iran, because you spoke about the crucial elections there and what that might mean for a whole bunch of things, including the nuclear deal with the US. What do you make of the changes looming large in Iran?
Well, while Israel formed a kind of a left of center national government with a right of center prime minister, Iran went in the other direction. And they had a President Rouhani who was kind of moderate. He was trying to find a way out. He unfortunately had a very difficult time because his presidency coincided with the Trump presidency in the United States, and the Trump was very hostile to Iran, as you know. And his term has ended with a lot of feeling of anger and disappointment and the feeling of being cheated among the Iranians. So they thought that these liberal policies have not really helped. Look at the way Trump treated them. So the Iranian leadership has really imposed Ibrahim Raisi, who's an ultra-conservative, yes, as the president. They made sure that through their selection process that or authentication process that there were no other candidates in the fray.
Huge number of candidates were
eliminated. You are absolutely right. They were eliminated. But this Ibrahim Raisi, now we don't know exactly what he will turn out to be. His past track record is his track record in the past is showing that he's an ultra conservative and he doesn't care for human rights. That's what his track record is showing. But there are now a lot of questions being asked and a lot of debate is taking place that because now that the conservatives are firmly in power, maybe it may be easier for Iran to negotiate a deal with the United States. Maybe. Right. But Raisi himself is saying that he will not meet Biden. So there is a lot of uncertainty in Iran, and we don't know which way it will go. But at least superficially, it is definitely a shift to the religious hardline lobby. That is at least what has happened. Whether it will stay like that or whether they will use their self-confidence in controlling Iran to negotiate some new deals, that is something that we have to see. Sundeep, but in the meanwhile,
go ahead.
No, while Iran has moved to this kind of a ultra-conservative position, UAE did something very small but very interesting. They decided to establish physically a complex, what they call Abrahamic complex, where they are building a mosque, a church, and a synagogue together in one compound. And that is absolutely unusual in the Islamic world to build a synagogue and a church touching the mosque in the same compound with the patronage of the rulers. It's something very unique, and they are trying to send a signal to the world that they do probably want to have a very liberal kind of an approach towards religion in future. And it's a physical complex that's being constructed. Means in the same complex you will have the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims visiting and cohabiting in that complex. So while Iran has moved to a religious hardline position, its arch rival in the Gulf, which is the UAE, has decided to create this Abrahamic complex of the coexistence of the three religions.
What explains that, Sandeep? I mean, what prompted the UAE to move in this direction? What's your understanding?
Well, whatever UAE has been doing, it's a bit mysterious. Nobody really knows what is happening, but they have been doing a lot of interesting things. There is a rumor, and I can't say one way or the other whether it is true, but there is a rumor that they were very actively involved in bringing about the thaw between India and Pakistan and the
Yes.
ceasefire that was agreed by
You
India,
mentioned
Pakistan.
it in the last podcast. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't know. So they kind of try to build a role of played a role of a peacemaker in the subcontinent. Now they have built this complex. They have a new kind of leadership in UAE for the last 2 to 3 years, not this year necessarily, but it has been there for some time. They have many young ministers, young men and women both in their 20s. A lot of women have been given important ministerial responsibilities.
Interesting.
Uh, and and uh, and their entire focus of the cabinet is towards science and high technology. That is where the government is going. And say UAE landed a rover on the Mars in 2020,
Right.
using Japanese facilities. So that is another interesting. So you have to look at all these things together. They're going to the Mars. They're apparently building peace in the subcontinent. They're building the Abrahamic complex. So all of this is showing that they probably and their emphasis on science and technology. They are building a museum of the future devoted to new technologies, and it probably shows that they have realized that they have to have a nuanced approach to religion if they want a society which is built on science.
Interesting. So just to go back, Sandeep, to Iran, because
Right.
the relationship with the US and how that shapes up will be interesting to watch, because I was reading somewhere that there is back channel negotiations going on in Vienna, and apparently there's been some progress on that. So are you kind of hopeful that Biden will perhaps be able to kind of bring the new Iranian establishment round to a deal on nuclear weapons in that country, or what's your view on that?
Well, you know, what is the American worldview? The American worldview is that they want to resolve as many conflicts as possible and focus their energy on China. That is American worldview in the Biden White House. So what you are hearing is definitely correct, that there are possibilities of a back channel between the Washington DC and Tehran. And mind you, this kind of back channel has existed in the past. It
Yes.
was there during the Clinton time also.
Yes.
So there is always an effort going on to create a back channel, and maybe there is a view in Washington that with Raisi being a total hardliner, Raisi is also likely to replace Ayatollah Khamenei
Yes.
as the new spiritual leader. So they think that maybe now this is the time to do business with
Although
the.
Khomeini does have a son who's also in contention, from what one hears.
Yeah, exactly. But so we don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
with the power game in any country,
Yes.
we don't know
Yes.
what happens. Yes, exactly. But with Americans must have thought that now they are in a position to deal with the decision makers,
Got it.
and the Americans are not shy of working with the extremists. See, they have worked with the Taliban to agree on a US troop withdrawal, pull out from Afghanistan. So the same Taliban whom they accused of supporting and providing bases to the terrorists to attack the US on 9/11 in 2001, they are doing business with the Taliban. and they are more or less handing over the country to Taliban in effect. So if they can do business with Taliban, why won't they do business with Iran? Also, one of the things that was discussed in the on the sidelines in G7 summit and in the NATO summit was that Biden basically told the Europeans to manage Russia and the threat coming from Russia. So the Americans would not like to get involved in that far too much. So that's why he had a kind of a deal with Putin to have a strategic stability dialogue, which is very significant. See, this talk about human rights and all that is naturally Biden needs it if he's talking about democracy versus autocracy. But the real thing was the decision on strategic stability dialogue. So if you take a overview, what you see Biden asking the Europeans to handle Russia, withdrawing from the Middle East, including Afghanistan, and trying to find some kind of a reconciliation with Iran, so that the Americans can focus their energy on China. They are really looking at the Chinese as a big threat for the next few decades. And
Sundeep, that's a pretty significant change, right, in tack, which you're talking about, which is to try and kind of de-escalate tension elsewhere in the world, but put your eggs in one basket, which is see China as the most important strategic threat and respond accordingly.
Exactly.
What form and shape will that take? I mean, is that amply clear now, or?
Well, it is emerging. The contours are emerging. One is, of course, a strategic vision, but there is also a very strong economic and technological vision. One of the most interesting things that happened, I think, in the last 3 months or 4 months, was that the American Congress has passed Innovation and Competition Act, and they have decided to invest $250 billion in new technologies, including $50 billion for manufacturing semiconductors and chips, and $200 billion are going to be invested most in artificial intelligence. So Americans are making a huge commitment, $250 billion of state money, and they hope that if the government is investing $250 billion, they will probably mobilize 4 times that much from the private sector. So you're talking about $1 trillion of investment being planned for investments in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and quantum computing. So these are the fields in which they are doing the investment. And another very important, the biotechnology or genomics. And all of this is designed as a package to counter China. Now, see, doing investment in production of semiconductors or artificial intelligence, biotechnology, all of that is fine. And you could project it as something that is required to increase the technological age of the US economy. But that is now how it is being projected. It is being projected as a counter to China. And there is a bipartisan consensus in the Congress on this issue.
Very interesting.
And yes, so the US-China rivalry, it started with a trade conflict during the Trump years, if you remember. Just a normal civil trade conflict. From there, it has expanded to strategic conflict, to political conflict, where the America now wants to organize the world into 2 camps. Now this economic and technological dimension, which they are developing. And that is quite interesting. There is, by the way, I mean, also something that India should be listening and reading the tea leaves from a development like the ICA, the Investment and Competitiveness Act. I mean, we talk about, wanting to have a global leadership, and we also talk about competition with China. But what is our investment in artificial intelligence? What's your investment in biotechnology? What's your investment in semiconductors, in quantum computing? How much is the government investing? How much is the private sector investing in all these new technologies? So these are the questions that we should be asking.
No, Sundeep, this is pretty important. The point you make about the whole battle for frontier and emerging technologies, which will in some ways become absolutely critical for establishing who really gains control. Now, the 2 things that I wanted to ask you about China, their work in space. I think there were some interesting developments which you spoke to me earlier about. Can you help us put that in perspective of what happened really in the last kind of quarter, and what has China really done to signal its intent in outer space and its leadership in outer
Well,
space?
it was very interesting what happened in the last quarter, that in the week that Biden was busy organizing, mobilizing European allies to support the United States against China, both in the G7 summit and the NATO summit, the Chinese were busy conquering the outer space. So they have set up a space station there. And there is currently an international space station which has been established through cooperation between Americans, Russians, and Europeans primarily, with maybe some involvement of Japan as well. Now, this international space station is going to retire in 1 or 2 years. And the Chinese space station, which was installed in the last quarter, is not a fully fledged body. So they sent a space station and they downloaded it in the space, which is just kind of made to the minimum level, and they are regularly sending cargo flights to the space to build up that station. So the actual construction is taking place in the space, and they have sent astronauts there, or cosmonauts, who are now, there are 3 of them living on the space station, and there are regular cargo flights going on. Yeah,
Okay.
like we said, cargo from Mumbai to Delhi or whatever, they are sending the cargo flights regularly to the space, and so they didn't even send a fully developed space station. So it's being constructed. And earlier, the Chinese, they got some stones and sand or whatever you call it, some samples from the moon. Last year, they landed on the other side of the moon, which is not visible, and now they have built a space station. So, but the strategic implication of all that, all this is very interesting, because in 1 or 2 years, because what happened in the last quarter, in the next 2 or 3 years, Chinese will be the only ones with a permanent presence in the space. And what is happening now is that the Russians have told the Chinese that they would like to be part of the Chinese space station. So, unlike the earlier space station where the Russians were equal partners with the Americans, and the Japanese and the Europeans also had a very respected role there, here it will be a Chinese space station, and you can all, even India, they are also happy to have India to join them, or whoever else wants, they can join them there. But it will be under the Chinese suzerainty, this space station. And what the Chinese are probably signaling is that and they did it exactly on the day these G7 and NATO summits were, and the week that G7 and NATO summits were taking place. And they are saying, you be busy in organizing on yourself on the earth, but we will control the space. And from there, we can control the telecommunication infrastructure of the world. We will be able to have a major influence on the movement of missiles. And they might, and for all you know, if there is a war that starts between United States and China in the next 20 years, it will not start in Taiwan or in East China Sea. It will start somewhere in the lower geosynchronous orbit. That is where it might start. So,
Right.
so in a way, this last quarter was quite a significant period for what is going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. And especially
Very
the
interesting,
requirement of the
Yeah.
international space station. I mean, the Chinese will be the only ones there. So,
Yeah. We need to
and the
watch this
Chinese,
space clearly.
exactly. So they are dominating the outer space. They are dominating the semiconductor industry. They have done tremendous strides in artificial intelligence and biotechnology, and what is called the petaflop computing. So Chinese are quite focused on the technological advancement. That's the message coming from their space adventure. And mind you, besides this, they have also landed on the Mars. Besides all this,
Right.
or they have sent a mission to the Mars. So this is quite interesting what happened in the last quarter.
Very interesting. Sundeep, you spoke about the seriousness with which the Americans have kind of doubled down on investments in emerging technologies and frontier science. There was one other thing that I wanted to discuss with you, which is the AI regulatory framework that the EU announced sometime in, I think, April.
Right.
What is so significant about that? Because last time when the Europeans had taken a big step on data privacy, with the GDPR regulation,
Right.
the Americans did not really play catch up. The rest of the world followed the Europeans, and the Europeans took the lead. On this one, what's likely to happen, and why is the AI thing significant to your mind, the regulatory framework that's been announced, if at all?
Well, as we can see first from the developments in the US, this new regulation of Innovation and Competitiveness Act and the developments which are taking place in China on the ground, AI is really emerging as at the core of the new technological horizon. And so a debate has started in the Western democracies, at least open debate. We don't know what the Russians and the Chinese are discussing, because if they are discussing anything, it is behind iron curtain, and we have no way to know the details of the discussion. But in Western democracies, including the US and Canada and Western Europe, the debate has started as to what could happen with AI. And the AI experts feel that AI could be very beneficial. It could be very useful to address problems like climate change, pandemics, and other problems facing humanity. But AI could also be manipulated or could be misused to create dangerous possibilities. This could include lethal autonomous weapons. This could include new kinds of military technologies. This could also include, the control of the social control of individual citizens. So there are a lot of dangers which could possibly come. In fact, there are indications that in China they are already using it for social control and for grading the citizens. As
Social profiling, yeah.
yeah, exactly. So the EU has now come out with a regulatory framework where it clearly says that certain kind of use of AI is simply not allowed. And one of them is that the grading of citizens, even for credit rating, is not allowed by
Yes,
AI.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
so they will not allow AI for to be used for, making categories of citizens or making categories of borrowers also. I mean, of course, banks have to grade their borrowers, but the EU says that AI will not be allowed. You do, in a normal human way, and so they have now categorized the use of AI in different categories, in different boxes. So some things are totally not allowed. Social rating is one of them. Some things will be subjected to very high degree of control, and some things will be encouraged. So this is the first time that a bloc has come up with a very clear and very definitive regulation of AI, and that's why it was very significant. Mind you, in America also there is a lot of concern and lot of debate going on about AI, and I guess that the AI community in the US may force the American political leaders to come out with some kind of a regulatory framework at some stage. When that will happen, we don't know,
Sure, sure.
because the Americans also want to have a strategic supremacy, and that would mean misusing AI deliberately or using it for weapons and not for social control. They won't do that, but for some of the other things. So there is a big consciousness growing even in the US that they must have this kind of regulatory
Framework.
framework.
Hmm.
But when they'll be able to persuade the Capitol Hill and the White House, that we have to wait and see.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Sandeep, you've covered a lot of ground, and as we always do, towards the end, we try and take stock of what's going on in our own neighborhood. And
Right.
one of the things that I think everyone's keen to hear your perspective is what happens next in Afghanistan, because that's kind of poised at a very, very critical juncture. There could be many things that could happen as a result. So, how would you help us understand what might ensue as the Americans pull out of Afghanistan?
Very simple: civil war. That is what we are looking at in Afghanistan, because you have Taliban expanding the territory under their control. You also have a strong Iranian influence in the western part of Afghanistan, and they will start exerting their influence. Iranians would not like to have, the Taliban and the other elements Afghanistan on a plate. So they will. And the current government of Ghani and forces like that and the Northern Alliance, they would also like to have control. So we are looking at a civil war post September.
And it would be safe to assume, I'm guessing, that the Taliban will emerge on top given the kind of advances they're making in the last few months, particularly. But is there no leverage that America has or the Western powers have on the Taliban? Because they have spread themselves out in the region and there is free movement. If is there something that the Americans can extract some promises from the Taliban that their movements could get in some ways restricted if they don't fall in line? And
Well, I've been seeing the television interviews of the Taliban spokesman, and he keeps saying that they have no desire to have a confrontational approach with other political groupings, but the situation on the ground is different. That they are, taking control of one town after another. So that is the reality. But the people who have a real leverage over Taliban is the Pakistani ISI.
Right.
Taliban can't survive without support from the ISI. And I have no idea what deal the Americans have made with the ISI. It looks like they probably have reconciled to the fact that Taliban will have a significant control on Afghanistan, if not total control, and Pakistan will be very happy with that kind of an outcome. But beyond that, we don't really know what is happening between Pakistan and the United States. Pakistan is no longer significant for the United States that used to be 5-10 years ago. So we don't know really what is happening there. But for India, it's important since Pakistan will acquire what is called the strategic depth if they have a control on some Afghan territory through Taliban. So it will be something very important to watch from our point of view. But we only have to see it after October what happens.
Right. And the last time you had spoken briefly about the ceasefire between the two armies, India and Pakistan, but that ceasefire seems to have been disrupted a wee bit, isn't it?
I think it is still holding despite the drone attacks, I would say, because there could have been a very different kind of a reaction to the drone attacks. There hasn't been. We don't know who organized these drone attacks because there is always something called spoiler violence. So they may not be necessarily directed from the very top of the Pakistani hierarchy. And in the ISI, there are a lot of freelancers within the ISI ranks.
Sure.
So we don't know at this stage if this is ordered from the top. It doesn't seem to be, because India would have reacted much more strongly if they had a feel that this was coming from the top.
But
So,
some of the comments that have come from the political establishment about the bombing in Lahore, very close to Hafiz Saeed's residence, seem to suggest that they're trying to implicate an Indian national at least in that bomb blast.
well, that's what the Pakistanis are saying, but the Pakistanis always say that. Yeah, in Balochistan there have been a lot of incidents, and they always say Indians have done it. So
Yeah.
I won't really take it too seriously.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is, I think we've covered a pretty large expanse of what's going on around the world, and very, very interesting perspectives as always, Sundeep. So thank you for sharing your wisdom, and we certainly do hope to catch up in the next quarter, at the end of next quarter, and take stock of what we're likely to witness.
Yes, definitely. I look forward to that. When we meet again in October, there would be already a new prime minister in Germany, and that will be very interesting to see.
Yes.
And the Americans will be formally out of Afghanistan,
Yes.
and that will be interesting to see. And the China-US is going to be an ongoing story. So stay tuned.
Yes.
I'll see you in October.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Niranjan. Bye.
Thanks.